We now have some time for discussion, but this will be preceded by a brief commentary which will be given by Professor Chris Hamnett. Professor Hamnett is a geographer working within the geography department here at King's, but is also a central figure in research in the cities research group within the geography department. So look forward to your
Thanks very much, Federico. Fascinating set of presentations. Obviously, first and foremost, I should thank the overseas speakers, I think, for their wonderful English. No need to apologise whatsoever. I think the native English speakers, such as myself, would of course be in deeply shameful and humiliated position if we were giving talks or attempting to give talks in German or Portuguese or whatever. So basically we're just terribly lucky. This morning started off with Josef raising this question of a loss of confidence in our ability to plan and to intervene and to spatial planning, which was something also that Peter Hall took up, and he began to raise the issue of, or address the issue really of regional inequalities and how one addressed inequalities, if you like, in the national space economy, and was giving these illustrations of different transport solutions as ways of attempting to reach out to distribute benefits into areas that in the Heineken advertisement, areas that are not otherwise reached. And this seemed to me to touch on issues that many, or actually most of the speakers raised, because Sir John Elvidge, I think, made some really interesting points about, again, the loss of confidence in urban policy and spatial planning. But if we look back over the last 30 or 40 years, it seems to me that there have been a variety of different approaches which have been tried, and I think unavoidably there has been a political dimension to this in different countries, particularly between left and right. And traditionally, when you're looking at issues of inequality, whether it's regional inequality, but inequality at the social level, income inequality, traditionally, I think the left's approach to this was to see the causes as lying in structural problems inherent almost in the nature of capitalist economies, and therefore what you would need is a structural solution to this. And actually, of course, before the urban programme, you've got the CDP, and of course the CDP whenever it was, I think the mid-70s, said that the problem fundamentally is to do with the organisation of economic organisation of society. That's what we need to address if we're looking at inequality. We can't tinker about. Now, in a sense, that perspective has become much weaker, shall we say, less influential in recent decades, and one has seen a variety of approaches, and obviously on the right, traditionally, the approach has been much more to look at the level of culture, at the issues of the family, even issues of individual morality, etc. So you can look at a range of approaches which range from the economic, in terms of interventions, through and of course interventions particularly focusing on the market, through interventions which are more designed to look at social issues, cultural issues, etc. And what's interesting about Sir John Elvidge's presentation is you were, in a sense, it seems to me, suggesting an additional approach, which is that of a shift in the structure of government in order to attempt to address these problems. And one can argue again with Sabine Suss that there is, when one looks at the role of the Stiftungs or the foundations, that perhaps this is an area, I know you didn't want to use the term of the big society, and you preferred, I think you said the enabling state, but there's that type of approach, and then there's the arguments about, well, fundamentally, perhaps the issues which Paul Plant raised about the persistence of health inequalities and the fact, and educational inequalities, which you touched on, that in a sense, over whatever has happened over the last 40 years, the bottom 30% in terms of educational attainment has scarcely been touched or addressed. And again, so you had the policies which said, okay, what we need is Sure Start, that type of thing, address the families at the begin, right at the etc. And then you find you have the perhaps predictable problem that initiatives like Sure Start, I won't use the term hijacked by, but are disproportionately utilised by better off, more middle class households of a greater awareness, etc. So then the question is, how do we take remove the possibilities for middle class households to access these things, to try to channel them more towards households that may have a greater concentration of disadvantage. Now at the moment, the current government, I think possibly New Labour before in Britain, had come up with the notion, and no idea where the figure comes from, that there are somehow 160,000 quote unquote problem families in Britain. If one can, somebody obviously has got a central register of who these folk are. Somehow the notion is that if you manage to deal with the issues of deprivation in these groups, then it may be possible to resolve a great deal of the problems we address. But then we're right back, just to round up my comments, we're back to the issues that were raised by, trying to remember them, Keith, Margaret Thatcher's advisor, Keith Joseph. And of course, Keith Joseph and the similar approaches in the US, basically we're looking at the notion of transmitted deprivation within the family. And the argument is, if you can address this is the cause. Now, of course, the left has systematically rejected this interpretation. The causes lie much deeper in the structures of capitalism, which is creating unemployment, etc. So they would reject that. But what we're seeing over the last 40 years or so, it seems to me, maybe much longer, is explanations and policy interventions which sort of shift from one dimension to the other. So at the moment we're back in Britain to the big society and the notion that the state should back off, but perhaps fundamentally the state does need to be much more centrally involved in addressing fundamental and long-term social and economic inequalities. But the question then is, how does it most effectively? So, I mean, I will stop there, but all of these presentations seem to be focusing on this. I mean, Paul seemed to be arguing that to some extent one should be seeking to empower those people who are, I might have misconstrued your comments, disadvantaged in health terms, and if you have a greater control of your own environment, your own job, you'll actually be healthier as a consequence. So to me, though they're very different presentations, they're all touching on the same issues, and Professor Favaretto was talking about the way in which spatial inequalities have changed in Brazil. Actually, your presentation seemed to show that in a number of respects, spatial inequalities, maybe I got this wrong, have actually reduced in Brazil over the last 30 or 40 years, which is a very interesting situation. But I think I must stop and ask for comments and contributions. And you wanted to say something, yes?
Just to pick up on that last piece, Bill comes from the OECD, and we published a territorial review in Brazil in the spring. Brazil is indeed remarkable. It's, converging economies typically see widening spatial disparities. Brazil is pretty much unique in that class of kind of major, reasonably well-performing convergence economies where they have declined. If you look closely at it, though, what you see is that it is overwhelmingly driven by resource regions, converging to more prosperous, urbanized, developed regions, and in between them you have quite a large category that aren't part of that process. So a lot of that is driven by resource extraction, particularly over the last decade. The related observation on that, it links somewhat to Sophia's presentation, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And I like a lot of the way he's thinking about extending some transport solutions into the harder-to-reach areas of metros. Nonetheless, when it comes to broader questions of regional development and the challenges of peripherality, I think I remain quite skeptical about infrastructure as the solution. Whether you're irrigating or draining is an open question, and it really depends on a great deal of what else is happening. And I think of this in connection with Brazil, because one of the things we looked at was infrastructure adequacy. And you see a sort of one-way relationship. You don't see well-performing regions with poor infrastructure provision. The well-performing regions have got comparatively good infrastructure. But you see a surprising number of regions with very good infrastructure provision, but nonetheless are performing very, very poorly. And it is the case that, accessibility issues are a form of market protection. And when you open up that market by improving access, it depends on what else has been going on in terms of improving capital, private sector development, etc. Related to that, though, this larger question of peripherality, I think, just struck me with a real paradox, because the problem of these increasingly peripheral places, whether it's in Europe or anywhere else in the world, stems from the fact that we have a process of population concentration which has been going on for several centuries now and shows no sign of stopping. It's hundreds and probably thousands of years old. It's not stopping as far as we can tell. It's not been such a problem in places where the underlying demographic was very, very dynamic. So that you had a lot of population, but increasing concentration of population in Stockholm. It's been going on for a very long time, say in Sweden. Not a great threat to provincial towns as long as their populations were growing, right? So this deeper challenge of peripherality, particularly in Europe, and this deeper challenge of second-tier places that are struggling to sustain themselves, it's grounded in a secular demographic trend. And I think we have to be fairly skeptical about how well we can address a demographic, a problem that is rooted in a fundamental demographic trend with an infrastructure solution, unless we kick these trams out so that people can go out like bunnies on the tram.
Okay, well that's a fascinating contribution. Some other comments or questions? Yes.
I was very pleased to hear Bona Takuria's suggestion that we have to, in a sense, interrogate the oftentimes the kind of complacency or delusion that comes with a kind of technocratic sensibility. And so asking that question about, well, does access to data and the accumulation of data and the analysis and management and control of the data sufficiently translate into to questions about how real decision making and real action take place? It seems to me invites us to open up the question of politics, right? I mean, rather than sort of treat policy considerations as if they are a purely technocratic sort of fear. I mean, your presentation in particular, I think, really sort of opens up that question. But I think that it's resonant with, you know, with Paul Plant's and Sabina Sousa's suggestions as well. That there's a real question here about, you know, the much more complex field of political struggle that lurks behind a kind of generic notion of community. So many people have sort of been gesturing in the direction of the idea of, you know, there's a community out there, but who is the community? How do we define the community? How is, you know, a notion of community constituted? What are all the fault lines and contradictions and conflicts that are built into a kind of variegated continuum of different notions of community? I think in the urban context in particular, this question immediately, you know, sort of raises all sorts of issues about a variety of different kinds of indices of inequality. And so I thought that this panel in particular had the virtue of really sort of bringing some of those questions more to the fore.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Yes. And then you, yeah.
I'm Rachel Flowers. I work for Public Health England. Previously, I was a director of public health in the East End Borough. And actually, there's always health warning with data. It's because actually how people interpret it. And actually, people use the term data and evidence-based. Now, evidence-based, many people, is what they've read in the Metro or what they've read in the local paper around this. And actually, it's not just politicians, it's all of us. Even the academics in the room, it's actually, we do the bartering of what we mean or not. And that's the challenge that we've got in terms of not just policy making, but actually how we, in our own communities and working with the communities to make things. So I want to kind of like think around the health warning around data and actually data is good. We all use it in a way that we know we shouldn't. And we could argue around that. The second thing is in terms of, I came from local government in the 1980s, and actually, to me, it's a complex structure, not just in England, but across the way, around physical build, infrastructure, community governance. And we're all defining the problems, but actually, it's about what lessons learned, what would we put in. One solution doesn't fit all. I work within 3 communities within the West Midlands who were parallel to each other. And actually a solution that worked for one community did not work for the other. I mean, Sabina will say around this. So there is macro and micro. We talked about the 10-year rolling plan. So it's about what lessons can we learn from the future. There's an awful lot of instant gratification around it. I love the fact that we're defining the problem, but I'd really like to have some solutions out there, even if they're not quite right. So I think that I'd really welcome working with the academics, working with the community to say, well, let's try and do a bit of things around here to see whether it does work, because it's not one solution. And I know those of you who've been around for longer than I have, when I came into local government, said, yes, we were doing this in the 1970s. Yes, we were, and we still haven't cracked it.
Yeah. Yes, so yeah, good point. Yes.
Philip Fletcher, I'd like to be a bit provocative. Since Professor Convitt's introduction, where the financial crisis and our extremely slow collective global recovery from that was mentioned, we haven't really talked about possible game changes. And this, I remind us, in the week in which the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has produced its latest survey showing ever more clearly climate change is happening, it will go on happening, we are causing it. When we have the whole issue of data and terrorism and some very real examples in front of us in an urban context to be concerned about, and then the potential for the capitalist system to be undermined by our inability to deal with what we ourselves have created there. Now, not wanting to be too alarmist, but are we right in this discussion to work off a basis of assumed near steady state, or should we be building some of those threats more deeply into our thinking on cities?
Yes.
This is a hunch, okay? I don't think as urbanists we actually solve problems. I think what we do is we mitigate the negative consequences of our actions and we try to promote positive consequences from our actions. And unless we understand that, we're in danger of taking our eye off the ball. And I'm provoked to make this comment, like this last comment on
Yes.
on climate change. I was in China last week, and we were talking about urbanisation and about problems that are faced by Chinese cities and what have you. And of course, the question of congestion always raises its ugly head, and the problems of climate change, pollution, and so on. And something occurred to me. When I started in town planning, the big problem in the early 60s, became a very serious problem by the end of the 60s and mid-70s, was the problem of the motor car, the social and political consequences of the motor car. We had the Buchanan report, which frightened us so much, we ended up, or the report itself, the consequence of the report, ended up doing more damage to UK town centres than the Luftwaffe.
Yes.
Because everyone dived in and started redeveloping to separate people from traffic and so on and so forth. It was the most catastrophic document that was ever produced in town planning, in my opinion. At the time, it was regarded as a seminal work.
Yeah.
Now, we've spent the last 40 or 50 years trying to deal with the consequences of the motor car. Now, recently, because of the climate change agenda, we're looking at ways of reducing our carbon emissions. One of the big things is transport. And everyone's trying to develop electric cars. And when I go around the world now, and I speak at conferences or I attend government meetings and everything else, they all talk about the fact that they've got really good solutions coming forward because they've got this new electric car. Now, I sit back and I think, hang on a minute, before we knew about climate change, before we were worried about emissions, the problem was the car per se. A fantastic invention, private transport, fantastic in terms of increasing people's opportunities, but something that everyone could not have without catastrophic consequences for urban areas. But now, as long as it's electric, it's a good thing. You know, we've got to not take our eye off the ball. We've got to focus on what the real problems are and how we can mitigate them. And certainly the electric car is less problematic than the petrol engine, but it's still a problem. But the car delivers a lot of benefits, so we've got to think of ways of using it more appropriately, less environmentally destructively, and so on and so forth. But we'll never solve the problem per se. And I think a lot of the urban issues that we address as planners, we don't solve them, we mitigate the impact. And I was, as a consequence of that, I'm particularly touched by the presentation on public health, which I thought addressed a whole range of issues, which I must say that as an urban planner, I've always played around on the fringe of this area. But really, you know, this suggests that we should be fundamentally rethinking the way that we do things and evaluate the consequences of our actions.
Okay, one more question possibly, or we can break. One more, Peter. Yes.
Can I just respond, especially to Bill's provocative initial remark? It seems to me what you're saying, that this follows what some other people said, is that the real problem is to ask what is the most effective answer to particular bundles of social problems at the margin. And since I was talking transport, let me tell a story. I was up some years ago in North East Lancashire in Pendle in a very interesting conference, and they said transport is the problem up there. And the guy after me was the chair of the local Chamber of Commerce, and he said the problem in this area is the education system, and he said particularly the performance of white working class males who come out of the schools at the age of 16 and they don't know how to say have a nice day. That always struck me that unless you learn to say have a nice day, you haven't got the soft social skills to do any job at the very base of the service economy. And therefore that suggests that you ought to be pumping more money into the school system, but it's useless if the school system doesn't teach the right skills. And shortly after this I read somewhere that in this country the problem is that many of these white working class males go through and they end up in prison. And the problem there is let's start teaching them to read and write if some of them can't. And the prison governor said, it's a pity we can't keep them in for twice as long. We're forced to release them after half a sentencing. But just when we're getting somewhere, we can help them to teach them to read and write. That suggests a lot of perverse conclusions. Maybe ought to put all the money in the jails, lock all these guys up for much longer, and then we might get some results. But you see the point? It's terribly difficult, I mean, to know, even if you have this total revision of government, so that you have a kind of senate of wise people at the top, how you would actually reallocate monies to make effective interventions.
Yes. I think probably on that note we should stop this. You're touching on a dangerous area here, Peter, because I remember two politicians particularly, one of which was Keith Joseph, and the other, of course, was Newt Gingrich in the US, who both said, you know, the real problem with transmitted deprivation is we need to really take the children away from the families. So Newt Gingrich, that's how his political career was destroyed, of course. One of three things was a policy basically of forced transferal. So there's very considerable dangers of suggesting that people should be spending more time in prison rather than less. But it's the issues are very real ones, and I constantly use Joseph and Gingrich as examples for my students to think about as policy initiatives. So anyway, I won't say have a nice day, but have a nice lunch.
Please come back promptly at 2 o'clock.